President Trump has said a lot about Canada, up to and including making Canada America's 51st state.
Perfect. As a great and cherished state.
The idea of a U.S. annexation of Canada hasn't really been considered for a very long time. This was really more of a thing back in the 1800s when Manifest Destiny was all the rage in America and the U.S. was rolling around taking large chunks of the continent. At that time, of course, Canada was a major British holding and it posed a relatively significant security challenge to the United States. However, several failed and disorganized invasion attempts ultimately put that idea to bed. That is, at least until Trump's second term. For the purposes of this video, we're going to be analyzing Canada using the PMASI-PT framework. And a lot of you that watch this channel or have been watching some of my recent videos are going to already be familiar with this. But for those of you that are not, the PMASI-PT framework really is a nice holistic or an attempt at kind of a quick overview of a country or geographic area. This helps us break down the why and how such a move is going to take place here. Obviously, this whole situation is kind of silly, but it's still a good exercise to kind of go through, do a little bit of research on Canada to see why exactly Trump is so fixated on the idea and whether or not there's actually any validity to the idea. Like in the past videos, I will be kind of reorganizing this just a little bit for this video, and I will be front loading the physical portion because I believe that that kind of provides a little bit of context for how the rest of, Canada kind of works. Geography is very important. So without further ado, we have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. First, of course, is the physical dimension. This covers Canada's geography and the strategic importance of its geography. Canada is the second largest country in the world, spanning nearly 10 million square kilometers, or if you're American like me, that's 3.85 million square miles. Its geography is diverse and extreme, creating both opportunities and obstacles for settlement, development, and a potential annexation. Of course, to the west, you have the Rocky Mountains in the western Korea. This stretches through British Columbia, Alberta, and Yukon. This is a massive mountain range that acts as a natural barrier along the western edge of Canada. This is, of course, difficult terrain for military movement and for infrastructural expansion. Cities like Vancouver and Calgary are positioned in more accessible valleys. And of course, we will be talking more in depth about infrastructure once we get to that section, but the sheer size of the country, the ruggedness of parts of its interior, and how spread out the population is really impacts things like the road network, but we'll talk about more of that in a minute. Next, you have the Canadian Shield, which stretches across large parts of Canada. This is a vast region of exposed bedrock, poor soil, countless lakes, covering nearly half of Canada. This is very poor farmland, but it is very rich in natural minerals. And this creates a key region for mining, like say gold, nickel, uranium, and copper. Most Canadians avoid settling in the Shield, and that leads to dense urbanization along the edges of the Shield. Next, you have the Great Plains and Prairies. This is through Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. These are large, flat, and fertile lands that support Canada's agricultural industry. Major urban centers like Winnipeg and Calgary exist here at critical trade and transportation hubs. Next, you have the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes region. The St. Lawrence River connects the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes. Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa, Canada's three largest cities, are concentrated here due to the accessibility. To the north, you have the Arctic and the permafrost regions. These are very harsh, frozen landscapes with permafrost covering nearly half of Canada's landmass. This is all nearly uninhabitable, but this is a strategic region. You might remember from my Greenland video that in 15 to 20 years, a lot of this may melt, and that might open up new areas for navigation and shipping. And so this area, this part of northern Canada, might become an incredibly strategic area as far as shipping is concerned, moving from the Atlantic to the Pacific and vice versa. We'll talk about this a little bit more on the military and the political section, but Canada and the U.S. already do collaborate on the Arctic and are both part of NORAD. But again, we'll talk about that in just a little bit. And then finally, you have the coastal regions. This includes the Pacific coast, which has more of a mild climate, deep water ports, key trade, and access to Asia. And then you have the Atlantic coast, which is a little bit more rugged. It has a very heavy fishing industry, more links to Europe, and has also some infrastructure tying Europe to North America with undersea cables. Of course, on the coast you have Vancouver and Halifax, and these are both very important in terms of both trade and diplomacy for Canada. We're We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the population on the social section, but just to kind of put all this into context and what's the so what for the physical domain, 85% of the Canadians live within 100 miles of the U.S. border, avoiding a lot of the harsher conditions in really the central and the northern part of Canada. Major cities are located near waterways, fertile land, and trade routes. Western Canada is growing faster than Eastern Canada as well, which is a very interesting thing to point out. Of course, Eastern Canada has been mostly inhabited for much of its history at this point, and so the expansion westward is still kind of an ongoing thing even to this day. Now, as far as natural resources and economic value is concerned, Canada is one of the most wealthy countries in terms of natural resources, making it highly valuable both for economic and strategic reasons. Of course, you have oil and gas. Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and Labrador all hold vast oil sands and offshore drilling sites. Canada also has the third largest oil reserves in the world, estimated at 1.71 billion barrels of oil. It's also rich in minerals and rare earth elements. Elements like nickel, copper, uranium, gold, diamonds, and lithium all can be found inside the Canadian Shield and parts of northern Canada. In terms of freshwater, Canada holds 20% of the world's freshwater reserves. Whenever it comes to forestry and timber, the Boreal Forest holds a $25 billion industry in lumber and paper. In fact, a lot of the lumber that the United States gets really comes from Canada. The Atlantic parts of Canada, as well as the Pacific coast, supply seafood exports worldwide as well. The prairies in Canada produce wheat, canola, and beef, also feeding global clients. So obviously you can tell that geographically there's a lot of benefit to Canada's position, not only from a strategic standpoint, but also very much from an economic standpoint. And that takes us to the political dimension. Canada operates as a constitutional monarchy, recognizing King Charles III as the head of state. It's still a part of the British Commonwealth. It is also a federal government that consists of three branches. It has the executive branch led by the Prime Minister and his cabinet. It has the legislative branch, which is a bicameral parliament, which comprises of the House of Commons and the Senate. Then it also has a judicial branch with independent courts that interpret its laws. Key political figures that are important and very relevant, especially right now, is the newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney, who's the Liberal of the Liberal Party and was sworn in on March 14th of this year. I want to zero in a little bit on Carney because I think that his election does mark a significant change, not just for Canada, but also for Canada's relationship to the U.S. Carney represents a shift towards a more centrist and economically pragmatic stance within the Liberal Party. He's more focused on fiscal responsibility coupled with progressivism. He has a background in banking. His approach contrasts with his predecessor, Justin Trudeau's more pronounced progressive agenda, indicating that this is a little bit of a recalibration of the Liberal Party's direction overall. And this really could not have come at a more critical time for Canada when they're dealing with a trade war with the United States that could have pretty dramatic political and economic impacts on the country as a whole. Carney's technocratic expertise is also viewed as an asset navigating complex economic issues. Prior to entering politics, he was the governor of the Bank of Canada in England. However, his lack of prior elected political experience does introduce some level of uncertainty into how exactly he's going to handle his time as Prime Minister. You also have the Governor General, Mary Simon, who represents the monarchy to Canada. Key cabinet members that are important to know, you have Dominique LeBlanc, the Minister of International Trade and Intergovernmental Affairs. This is also the President of the King's Privy Council for Canada. Imagine that, the King's Privy Council, that's crazy. Melanie Joy is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Bill Blair is the Minister of Defense, Francois-Philippe Chapin is the Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland is the Minister of Transport and Internal Trade. All of those folks are a part of the cabinet. Now, switching over to the kinds of political parties that are involved here, you have the Liberal Party, which is center to center left. It's currently leading the government and is one of the largest parties within Canada. Next, you have the Conservative Party, which is the main opposition. They're more of a center-right orientation. The New Democratic Party, or the NDP, is left-wing and advocates more for social democratic policies. Next, you have the Bloc Québécois, which focuses on Quebec nationalism and interests. And then, of course, you have the Green Party, which emphasizes environmental issues and sustainability. Now, like I said before, Canada is part of the Commonwealth, so their relationship with Britain is very, very important. Canada and the United Kingdom share some very deep historical connections. Obviously, Canada was really colonized mostly by the Brits and the French. And so you see kind of two different areas of Canada where that identity is very pronounced. Of course, you have Quebec, which has a very heavy French influence and has a very strong independence movement. And then you have the other parts of Canada that are more British, and they really embrace their role in the Commonwealth. Of course, today that relationship between Canada and the UK still remains incredibly strong. In fact, Prime Minister Carney's first international visit was to London, where he met with the King. Notable that this was not a visit to the United States, his strongest and closest partner geographically, but that makes a lot of sense given just kind of how the state of affairs are between the US and Canada at the moment. To me, this seems to send a bit of a message to the United States that he's going to lean on Canada's older friends in Europe and less so with the United States, and that he's more willing to continue to, resist against US economic pressure. In terms of international alliances and partnerships, Canada is pretty well networked. Of course, it's one of the founding members of NATO and has contributed to NATO defense initiatives for decades. It's part of the G7 and it participates in discussions of global economic policies in that group. It's also obviously part of the United Nations and it plays a role with peacekeeping and international diplomacy. It's also very notably part of the Five Eyes intelligence group, which is an intelligence sharing organization between the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand. This has been one of the alliances that the US has talked about using as leverage, like, kicking Canada out of the Five Eyes. Now, whenever it comes to its relationship with the United States, there are some additional partnerships that it's had. For example, it engages with significant trade with the United States, and of course, the tariffs are kind of threatening that status. Currently, Canada is part of the USMCA, which is the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, and this was Trump's replacement for NAFTA during his first term, and this came into effect right at the very end of his term in 2020. Of course, this agreement is at risk due to the threat of tariffs. It's also part of a pretty significant defense collaboration organization called NORAD, and this really facilitates a lot of defense coordination between Canada and the United States, making sure that North America is secure from outsider threats. For example, anytime Santa Claus decides to come down to North America, he's being heavily tracked by Patriot missile systems and F-22s. He will not enter the city of Philadelphia. In terms of border security, this has been one of the other more controversial topics, especially politically between the US and Canada. After some pressure, Canada has increased a little bit its border presence, but really, if you look at the differences between the US and Canadian border, and then for example, the US and Mexican border, there is a night and day difference. A lot of the border has been quite open, and it's very easy to travel between the US and Canada. And this is, of course, something that's going to be a focus for probably a number of years now. Now, in terms of political orientation and public support for the government, obviously the government tends to lean with a little bit more of a liberal stance, being that the Liberal Party is in control of the government. This is where the government tends to advocate for more progressive policies, including social welfare and environmental initiatives. In terms of public support, recent polls indicate a bit of a narrowing gap between liberals and conservatives, with Carney viewed a little bit more favorably in key areas. Again, remember, he's a little bit more center than left than Trudeau was. So we'll have to just kind of see exactly, practically speaking, what that means for Canada in terms of policy. Again, remember, he only just got elected weeks ago as of the moment this video came out. In terms of public sentiment, though, support for the government is very heavily influenced by the recent news of, the spike in tensions between the US and Canada. And so a lot of Canadians seem to be very concerned about economic strength, political independence, and sovereignty. Next, let's talk about Canada's military. Despite its size, it actually has a very storied history. If you look at Canada's role in World War I and World War II, they were some just straight up savages. They did some pretty crazy stuff in defense of democracy and freedom. So, hats off to them. But today, they're definitely a very small military. And again, a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this video kind of ties into the key theme of why Washington and Ottawa are beefing at the moment. There are a list of grievances within Washington that Canada isn't really doing its part in some key areas. We've already talked about border security, talked a little bit about economic policy, but defense is certainly a key part of that. But just at a glance here, the Canadian military is a three-branch branch military. It's got the Royal Canadian Navy, which is responsible obviously for naval operations and coastal defense. It's got the Canadian Army, which covers land operations and homeland defense. Then it's also got the Royal Canadian Air Force, which obviously is its air component, also includes surveillance and transportation capabilities. In terms of personnel, like I already said, the military is incredibly small. Out of its population of 40 million people, its military is only about 68,000 active members, with its reserve component making up about 27,000 members. There's also a subcomponent of its military called the Canadian Rangers, and that's only about 5,000 individuals. So again, incredibly small for the population size. In terms of conscription, if they have anything like that, they don't. It's an all-volunteer force similar to in the United States, and they don't really want to implement any kind of conscription or mandatory military service. And really, Canadians have historically opposed any form of mandatory military service. There have been some Canadians that have called for that kind of a structure, especially given the rising list of global threats, up to and including increased tensions with the United States. However, this is a very contentious political issue that really is not likely to happen anytime soon. In terms of capabilities and platforms that they operate, the Royal Canadian Navy, we'll talk about first. They have 12 Halifax-class frigates, 4 Victoria-class submarines, 12 Kingston-class coastal defense vessels, as well as some other smaller vessels that they operate. Again, mainly they're focused on maritime defense, sovereignty patrols, and support for international missions. They do have a pretty significant coastline, but it is, of course, again, split by the North American landmass and the Arctic Sea. Like I've already mentioned, we'll see how this kind of evolves in the next 10 to 15 years as the ice begins to melt and economic routes in the north begin to open up. The Canadian Army is relatively well equipped. They operate the German Leopard 2 main battle tank. They use LAV armored vehicles as well as C-72 assault rifles. In terms of capabilities, they're capable of mechanized infantry operations, domestic disaster response, and international peacekeeping missions. But again, remember, they're incredibly small. So wherever they go, they're going to need some sort of international support to sustain them and also provide some level of back, especially in more high-intensity conflict areas. The Royal Canadian Air Force operates the CF-18 Hornet. They were in talks of purchasing the U.S. F-35. However, that, of course, is now up in the air with the current trade tensions, and so the word is that they're looking at European assets that they could purchase. They also operate the CC-177 Globemaster transport aircraft, as well as the CH-147 Chinook helicopters. Their capabilities are, of course, some level of air defense, as well as strategic and tactical airlift, search and rescue operations as well. Now, in terms of defense spending, obviously their military is small, and their budget kind of reflects that. Their defense spending is really only 1.3% of Canada's GDP, totaling about $27.2 US, and that's as of 2023. Canada is one of the worst offenders that Trump has pointed to historically whenever it comes to NATO members not paying their share in terms of defense. Now, granted, obviously, we've already talked about geography. They don't have a lot of nearby enemies. They have Russia on the opposite end of the Arctic Sea, but they also have the United States that has Alaska between them and Russia to the west and has the world's largest navy and one of the world's largest air forces. So they haven't exactly had that level of threat from outside forces really kind of kick up to the point that they felt that they've had to increase defense spending. But this is, again, we're coming to that point where there's a land war in Europe with Russia and Ukraine that NATO is very focused on, and Canada has a piece in the response to that. There's some angst in Washington that Canada is just not prepared to be able to do its part if a war were to break out. And that, of course, takes us to its participation in its alliances. For example, with NATO, it is an active contributor and an active member of NATO. It's been very involved in different exercises. Again, there's a difference between exercises and then actual real-world conflict. They're also a part of NORAD. And we've already talked about a little bit of what that is, but again, they maintain a level of joint monitoring and defense of the North American airspace alongside the United States. They're also, obviously, as I've mentioned before, part of the Five Eyes intelligence community, and they've been a contributor to that as well. However, of course, like I've also already said, that this is another key area that is being used as leverage against Ottawa. As far as foreign deployments and exercises, they are obviously deployed in parts of Eastern Europe to include Latvia, and they've contributed to some significant exercises in that area. They're also part of UN peacekeeping engagements, such as in Mali and other parts of the world. They're also regularly involved in bilateral exercises. For example, they've had joint exercises with the United States and with the UK and with some of its other bilateral allies. Canada was also an active contributor to Iraq and Afghanistan in support of the United States. So despite its size, it's still been very active. Now, in terms of threat assessment, of course, I've already mentioned the Arctic area. There's the emerging threat of Russia that could pose some challenges for North American security, and Canada is at the forefront of this challenge. Now, of course, we talked about this in the Greenland video, for example. Trump has talked about taking Greenland and trying to get an increased U.S. presence in the Arctic. Of course, we already have Alaska, but Canada has a pretty significant coastline and access to the Arctic Sea. And we've already talked about their naval size, their air force size, their army size. They may not really be able to balance more than just one thing at any given time. And right now, it looks like their primary focus has been their involvement with NATO. Obviously, the Arctic Sea is a lot closer to Canada than Eastern Europe is. Cybersecurity is, of course, becoming a larger and larger concern with Canada. So that is becoming a key area of integration and collaboration, especially within Five Eyes. Then, of course, counterterrorism. Some of the more high-profile fighters, foreign fighters that joined ISIS came from Canada. And that's not to single Canada out. I mean, just about everybody had some pretty high-profile folks join their ranks. But that's just to show that Canada is certainly not immune to this kind of thing. And this is another issue that they're going to have to be able to account for. Now, we're going to also talk a little bit about law enforcement because this is important here. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, maintains federal and national law enforcement, and it serves as Canada's version of a gendarmerie. They enforce the federal laws. They provide policing services in province and territories that do not have their own police forces. Maybe they're very remote. And this also ensures border integrity. Now, they do have some challenges in law enforcement, and this is really just a testament to how large of a country Canada is. Enforcing law in some of the more vast and less populated areas is very logistically challenging. This is very similar to what we talked about in the Mexico video, where the terrain can pose some law enforcement challenges, and that can lead to some issues. Now, Canada obviously doesn't deal with the same kinds of internal threats that Mexico does, but it's still no less a challenge. For example, with collaborating and meeting with Indigenous communities throughout Canada that might live in more remote areas, this leads to some unique challenges with promoting trust and really collaboration, especially if it's more difficult to reach them. In terms of urban centers, they also help manage crime and public safety. Rule of law, as far as we all are aware and looks pretty clear, is not as significant an issue in Canada as it is in other countries. Overall, like I've said, they're a very small military that's very active abroad. But if war were to break out just about anywhere, Canada is going to run into some pretty significant and immediate challenges pretty fast. They have a very high reliance on the United States for logistical and intelligence support. And this is similar to just about any U.S. ally, but it's not exactly a good thing to have in common with some of them. This is especially a concern whenever the U.S. president, who they are relying on, is using words like Canada and Annex in the same sentence with a straight face. Next, let's switch to the economic side of things, and this is talking about, Canada's economic strengths and challenges. Quick overview of their economy. As of 2024, Canada is the world's 9th largest economy with a nominal GDP of approximately $2.117 trillion US dollars. They operate on the Canadian dollar, which has experienced some very recent fluctuation due to the recent trade tensions. In fact, it has strengthened actually by 0.4% to 1.4385 per Canadian dollars to US dollars. And this is influenced heavily by a rebound in equity markets within Canada since the inauguration of Prime Minister Mark Carney. Again, like I said, Mark Carney comes from a finance and banking background, so there is some level of confidence that he'll be able to manage a trade war particularly well. It definitely appears to be setting up for a bit of a showdown of strength on strength. You've got a business magnate with a banking magnate going up against each other here on a trade war. In terms of economic strength and industrial distribution, in terms of manufacturing, its automotive industry is centered more around Ontario, and this plays a very crucial role in North America's integrated automotive sector. I say integrated because a lot of automotive companies will have factories either in Canada, the US, or Mexico and will sell across the board. This is, of course, something that President Trump's trying to consolidate within the United States, and this is a key factor with a lot of these tariffs, is trying to get automotive companies to move to the U.S., and if they don't, then their products will have like a 25 or a 50% tariff placed on it on import. So we'll just have to wait and see exactly how this impacts Canada's automotive industry, but this is a key area of concern. Of course, it has a large aerospace industry, which is largely based around Quebec, as well as Montreal. Canada also has a pretty large technology and services industry. Its IT industry is largely based out of Toronto and Vancouver, and the financial sector is also largely out of Toronto, with Toronto being the banking capital. A lot of Canada's major banks and financial institutions are actually based out of Toronto. In terms of agriculture, Saskatchewan and Manitoba are vital for wheat and canola production. And whenever it comes to services, in terms of GDP, approximately 70.2%, and this is as of 2017, so a little bit dated statistic, but as of 2017, 70.2% of Canada's GDP comes from the service sector. This includes key things like real estate, rental and leasing, which is about 266 billion Canadian dollars to GDP in 2023, employs about 291,000 people. The finance and insurance industry, which is about 152 Canadian dollars in GDP in 2023. This employs a lot more people, about just under 836,000 individuals. Healthcare and social assistance accounts for 149 billion Canadian dollars in GDP. This is an absolutely massive industry. It employs just under 2.3 million people. And then, of course, you have the professional, scientific, and technical services, which is about a 135 billion Canadian dollar GDP in 2023. And this employs about 1.2 million people. So some pretty large, pretty robust economic sectors that provide actively for the Canadian economy here. In terms of industry, and this is about 28.2% of Canada's total GDP as of 2017. This includes things like manufacturing, which employs about 1.6 million individuals and is just under $200 billion in GDP in 2023. You've got construction, which is about 150 billion Canadian dollars in GDP, with a workforce of, again, about 1.1 million people. And then you have mining, quarrying, oil, and gas extraction, which is about $160 billion Canadian GDP industry, and this employs about 213,000 individuals. In terms of natural resources, Canada is the leading exporter, with Alberta's oil sands being a significant contributor here. Mining, like mining rich deposits of gold, nickel, and uranium, and this is primarily located in the Canadian Shield region. The agricultural sector, and this is in terms of GDP, about 1.6% of the Canadian GDP as of 2017. This employs about 2.3 million people across Canada and is also about a 150 billion Canadian dollar industry. In terms of recent economic performance, the fourth quarter of 2024 led to some amount of growth within the Canadian economy. In fact, it's about a 2.6% on an annualized basis from 2024. This exceeded expectations for Q4 of 1.8%. However, this growth is due to increased consumer spending, business investments, and exports. Now that we've outlined all of that and we've outlined their level of growth, let's transition in the fact that now they're in an active trade war with the United States. As of March 12, 2025, the U.S. implemented 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports. And this targeted Canada and other countries, but of course this is hitting Canada relatively hard. Canada retaliated with their own tariffs worth about $20.7 billion. This affects products like computers and sporting equipment. There's also the looming threat of additional tariffs from both sides that could come as early as April, and that could also include things like energy, which is exported to the United States. In terms of economic growth and its impact from the tariffs, the OECD projects Canada's economic growth to actually be halved due to these threats, with potential to erase 2 years of economic progress. In terms of unemployment, some analysts are expecting a rise in unemployment from 6.6% to 8%, equating to around 150,000 job losses in Canada. In terms of long-term challenges, this might lead to some significant supply chain disruptions, with a lot of uncertainty about companies that are based in Canada that rely on U.S. products being taken into a state of paralysis, which is hindering some level of decision-making and also supply chain planning. There's also some investment hesitancy. A lot of business businesses and international investors are hesitant to invest in Canadian businesses due to the unpredictable environment and due to the threat of U.S. tariffs. In terms of export dependence, approximately 75% of Canada's exports are destined for the United States, making it highly susceptible to this kind of an issue. According to some estimates, tariffs could lead to a reduction in Canada's GDP by about 2.5% by early 2026. Given Canada's nominal GDP of approximately $2.1 trillion as of 2024, a 2.5% decline equates to an annual economic loss of about $52.9 billion US dollars. Dependence on natural resources in Canada has also led to some large price fluctuations within the market. And there's also, similar to in the United States and a lot of other Western countries, some high levels of household debt and consumer debt that's posed by domestic consumption and financial instability. Now, this leads to some potential economic leverage against the United States that Canada has. In terms of energy exports, Canada supplies the United States with 60% of crude oil imports and 99% of its natural gas imports. Imposing tariffs on these exports could restrict these exports and could significantly impact U.S. energy prices. This has also led to other issues like the threats of shutting off power to parts of New York and other parts of the northern U.S. that rely on natural gas flowing through Ontario. In terms of critical minerals, Canada is a major supplier to the U.S. of uranium and other essential minerals. This could become another factor that could play into things. In terms of retaliatory tariffs, we've already seen some level of retaliation from Canada, but targeting U.S. agricultural products and manufacturing goods could also pressure specific U.S. industries in parts of the middle of the United States. Overall here, as you can tell, we have a very robust economy that's under a significant amount of duress. A lot of these tariffs have been delayed, but some of them have not, and they're already being implemented. And there's the active threat of a lot of these tariffs being placed as early as April 2nd. And this seemingly out of nowhere political targeting from south of Canada's border has created a lot of uncertainty within Canada. This actively challenges parts of Canada's economy that are ill-prepared for a kind of test like this and may not have forecasted some. I don't know if anybody was really forecasting a trade war between the US and Canada in 2025. Pretty crazy stuff. Of course, the big threat to Canada is its supply chain. While Canada has some levers to pull against the US, especially in terms of supply chain, the US kind of has more of them. Currency depreciation is always, of course, a threat. Unlike the US dollar, the Canadian dollar is really only used by Canada. So it's much less stable than the US dollar is as a global basket currency. Canada could attempt to rebalance and kind of transition its economy from a dependence and interconnectivity with the United States to more interconnectivity with Europe. However, this will not happen without potentially extensive and painful transition periods. And this could be undermined by the US dominance on the continent. For example, if let's say China does try to pivot to more connection with China, they'll likely face some enhanced blowback from the United States, especially whenever it comes to security and intelligence cooperation. Europe is, of course, a very clear and obvious option for Canada to pivot to. Of course, they have the UK, they have France, they have some other European countries that they have a very strong relationship to, but there's really no replacing the number one economy in the world that they also happen to share one of the world's longest borders with. Now, all of this takes us to the social phase of this analysis. Canada's social landscape is very diverse, with a lot of linguistic variety, multiple practice religions, and evolving public sentiments, especially in light of everything that we've talked to up to this point. In terms of demographics, as of the fourth quarter of 2024, Canada's estimated population is around 41.47 million people. In terms of age breakdown, you have, the youth of, 0 to 14 years old. That makes up just under 16% of the population. You have working age individuals, 15 to 64 years old, and that's about 65.03 of the population. And then you have retirees about 65 and older, which is about just under 19% of the population. In terms of median age for males, it's about 40 years old, and for females, it's about 42 years old. In terms of gender breakdown, the ratio is about 0.99 males per female, so it's about as balanced as you're going to get in terms of the world. A lot of countries have a very imbalanced gender breakdown, so Canada is kind of unique in this way. Now, in terms of ethnic composition, Canada is majority white. Just under 70% 6% white, 7.1% South Asian, 5% indigenous, 4.7% Chinese, 4.3% black, and then, kind of a number of other ethnicities that are also relatively small in terms of population share. In terms of population distribution, however, it is also kind of interesting. The population is predominantly urban, believe it or not, with major concentrations in Ontario. Ontario has about 38.3% of the population. Quebec has about 22.8% of the population. British Columbia, 13.5%, and Alberta, 11.7%. The largest cities in Canada include Toronto, which is the most populous city, has about 3 million people in the metro area. Montreal is the major cultural and economic hub. This has about 1.8 million people. Vancouver, key port along the Pacific coastline, and then Calgary and Edmonton in Alberta. These are very large centers for their oil, gas, and mining industries. Now, these urban areas are largely located along the southern border, and this benefits from not only a milder climate, the further north you go, the more harsh and uninhabitable it can get, but also the economic proximity to the United States. In fact, Toronto sits between New York and the state of Michigan. If you're American, instead of driving 8 hours from Buffalo to Detroit by going south through Ohio, you could just drive about 3 or 4 hours through Canada near Toronto. In terms of languages, Canada is officially bilingual, with about 56% of Canadians speaking English as their first language, and about 21% of Canadians speaking French as their first language. They also have a number of other languages that are largely spoken in Canada. However, these are nowhere near 2% in terms of language share. You have Mandarin, Cantonese, Punjabi, Spanish, Tagalog or Filipino, Arabic, German, and Italian. In terms of religions, Canada is technically religiously diverse, encompassing nearly 100 different religions. However, it is still largely Christian or either no religious affiliation. 53% of Canadians practice some form of Christianity. About 34.6% of Canadians have no religious affiliation. And a distant third place is 5% of Canadians that practice Islam. In terms of public sentiment on the U.S. and the current trade war, recent U.S. tariffs and political rhetoric have really impacted the Canadian public opinion. It's really injected a level of national pride. In February 2025, an Angus Reid Institute poll revealed a 10 percentage point increase in Canadians feeling, quote, very proud of their country as of December 2024. I never thought we would see the day of Canadian nationalism actually becoming a thing, but how about it? In terms of economic concern, about 40% of Canadians express some degree of concern about potential job losses and economic strength due to the trade war. In terms of boycott movements, a significant portion of Canadians are actually avoiding U.S. products and avoiding travel to the U.S. 42% of those polled are avoiding U.S.-made products. And in terms of travel, a substantial number of Canadians have either canceled or are considering canceling trips to the United States, which potentially impacts the U.S. economy by about $2.1 billion and about 14,000 U.S. jobs. In terms of Canadian perception of the U.S., a Lager poll pointed out that about 27% of Canadians now view the United States as an enemy, a sentiment reciprocated by only 1% of Americans towards Canada. So all of that's very interesting. Let's talk a little bit about the infrastructure domain. This, of course, is where the geography really starts to make itself known and the impact is pretty acute. Canada boasts over 1.4 million kilometers, and that's 870,000 miles of roads encompassing both urban and rural areas. And again, this is mostly focused on the country's south. The national highway system includes about 38,000 kilometers of key routes essential for trade and travel. In terms of condition, though, while many major highways are very well maintained, there are definitely challenges in more rural and remote regions of Canada where road conditions can be less reliable. That's either due to weather, due to difficulties in getting any kind of construction crews out to repair or maintain some of the roads. But definitely in the south, things appear to be pretty well maintained. In terms of rail, Canada has about 72,000 kilometers or about 45,000 miles of operational track, but the focus, similar to in the United States, is primarily on freight transport. There are some large and well-known passenger lines, but again, by and large, it's mostly for logistics. There is a lot of interconnectivity in terms of rail between the United States and Canada, not only because of the strong economic connections up to this point, but just proximity as well. In terms of ports, Canada operates about 300 commercial ports and harbors, which provides access not only to the Atlantic and the Pacific, but as well as the Arctic and the Great Lakes. Some of their largest ports, of course, are the Port of Vancouver. This is their largest port. It handles a lot of diverse cargo and serves as a gateway to Asian markets from North America. You have the Port of Montreal, which is a large commercial hub which can handle containerized cargo that connects European and Mediterranean markets with Canada. And then you have the Port of Halifax, which also supports transatlantic shipping. In terms of airports, you have some key major international airports. You have the Toronto Pearson International Airport. This is Canada's busiest airport, and this includes extensive international and domestic travel. You have the Vancouver International Airport, a significant gateway to Asia and the Pacific area from Canada. You have the Montreal Pierre Elliott Trudeau International Airport, which serves as a hub for flights going to Europe, the Americas, and other domestic destinations. In terms of capabilities, these major airports can handle just about any kind of travel, whether domestic or international, and they are equipped with modern facilities to accommodate larger passenger volumes as well as any kind of military aircraft. There have been some infrastructure challenges that Canada has dealt with, including aging infrastructure. Very similar story to in the United States. A lot of components, especially in urban areas, require a lot of updates to meet the demand. A lot of growing, cities in Canada, similar to the United States, are really having to, strain their infrastructure to accommodate the growing population, and this is leading to some challenges. Of course, you have trade corridors that are largely used and being heavily impacted by that usage that requires some level of maintenance. The impact of this trade war will definitely lead to some speculation on what exactly is going to happen to these trade gateways. You also have high-speed rail initiatives. The Canadian government has pledged about 3.9 billion Canadian dollars over a 6-year period for planning a high-speed rail linking Quebec City to Toronto. Now, this is something that if you're American like me, you're probably like, man, I'm jealous of that. But that's definitely an initiative that they're working on. So overall, well-developed infrastructure, well-networked, very similar to the United States in terms of quality. Their largest challenges are more in the remote and northern areas of Canada, where it's just going to be difficult just by nature. That's just how it is up there. Next, we're going to talk about the information domain. This is definitely kind of tied to infrastructure, but also with media consumption habits. So this also ties a little bit with the social domain because a lot of that is demographic based. In terms of internet access, Canada has very good access to internet. As of 2022, over 93.5% of Canadian households had access to high-speed internet services. The government aims to connect about 98% of Canada by 2026 to achieve universal coverage by 2030. In terms of urban and rural areas, while urban areas enjoy widespread and high-speed internet availability, more rural and remote areas of Canada face a lot of challenges. And this leads to, say, Starlink being available, at least up until recently, to these areas where getting a lot, like a fiber optic cable out, will prove expensive and logistically challenging, especially given just the span of space that would have to go. But Starlink is capable of providing high-speed internet access just, as soon as the radar gets there. Of course, that takes us to fiber optic and satellite coverage. In 2023, investment included about 7.8 billion Canadian dollars, with about 3.3 billion dollars allocated for fiber optic cables to enhance the speed of communication across the country. In terms of satellite, there's not just Starlink, there are other satellite providers, but they are really largely trying to increase the level of coverage across the more remote regions of Canada. Now, in terms of internet consumption and how people receive their information, in terms of television, as of 2022, 71% of Canadian households subscribe to a paid TV service. This is a slight decrease from 2018 of 73%. In terms of those services, though, the most popular of those services is with 32% going through cable. Fiber optic TV is seeing some growth with 21% as of 2021 to 28% in 2022. Satellite TV subscriptions actually declined to 11% per household. In terms of internet service, by 2023, the Canadian telecommunications sector generated about 59.6 billion Canadian dollars in terms of revenue. This is a 4.3% year-over-year increase, primarily driven by a $2.1 billion rise rise in mobile revenue. Now, this takes us to how people consume, like, say, their news and how they consume their information. And this is where the demographic piece really starts to step in. In terms of internet is the most popular method for following the news, with about 80% of Canadians utilizing it for that purpose. About 67% of Canadians use television for news, and about 40 to 36% of the population. And in terms of radio and newspaper, about 40% and 30% respectively of the population use those platforms. Now, here in terms of age breakdown, if you're 15 to 34 and you're Canadian, there's 95% of those folks will use the internet for the news, and about 45% of them use television. Now, that contrasts pretty significantly. If you're 35 to 54, 87% of those folks use internet for the news, and about 65% use television for the news. And again, it continues to flip. Ages 55 and older, about 63% of those individuals use the internet for use, and 88% of them use television for the news. Again, this is pretty typical of what we've seen from our analysis with other countries. Younger folks tend to use the internet, older folks tend to use TV and radio. Again, similar to other countries, social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram are some pretty significant news sources, especially for younger Canadians. Older Canadians tend to use print media and more traditional media outlets. Now, the final domain we're going to talk about here is time, and this is kind of interesting. Canada actually spans 6 different time zones. It spans Pacific, Mountain, Central, Eastern, as well as Atlantic and Newfoundland have their own time zone. Now, this kind of makes things very logistically challenging, especially whenever trying to coordinate, government and military coordination across these time zones. In terms of travel time, it can be very time consuming, moving from one end of Canada to the other. And this, of course, makes things like, economics and logistics very challenging. For example, let's say, you wanted to go from Washington, D.C. to Ottawa, that's capital. That's a 1.5 hour flight or a 9-hour drive. If you want to go from New York City to Toronto, that's about a 1.5 hour flight as well, or about an 8-hour drive. But domestically, if you wanted to go from Vancouver to Toronto, that's about a 4.5 hour flight or about a 40-hour drive. And from Toronto to Montreal is about a 1-hour flight or a 5-hour drive. Now, again, remember, all these population centers are largely in the south of Canada. If you wanted to go up to, the Arctic area in terms of, let's say there's a military reason to go up there, it's going to take a long time. The response is going to be particularly slow. It's going to be very reliant on air or naval movement, depending on the time of year. Now, let's for a moment continue to just kind of imagine that what Trump is saying about annexing Canada seriously, and just kind of, let's gameplay this a little bit in our minds. What's the kind of timeline that we would be looking at here? Annexation would take years to even decades to implement fully, with an extended period required for both legally restructuring Canada. Canada would have to be legally adopted into U.S. statehood, and it would have to have its laws reflect, that of a U.S. state and that under the U.S. federal government. Its currency and economic system would have to be integrated. This would be shifting from the Canadian dollar to the US dollar. There would be public resistance and potentially some sort of larger resistance to this kind of effort, given the rise of Canadian nationalism that would take years to be able to suppress. Just some comparisons for reference, it would be more like Hawaii or Texas, which is a multi-decade process of cultural and political assimilation. AKA, this is not going to happen in the near term, even if it started today in earnest. It's more likely to be a decade-long project if it happens at all. But come on, it's not going to happen. Right. So overall, that is Canada at a glance. This is a long video, and I'm looking here. This probably won't be this long by this point for you. I've been recording for about an hour now. I'm ready to stop recording. But let's do a quick little summary of what we've just talked about and kind of make this make sense for the purposes of the trade tensions and a potential annexation. As you can see, Canada is a very large, wealthy, robust country with a very capable economy, large alliance network, and powerful neighbors. Recent months have seen things slide between the U.S. and Canada. However, if you kind of, take the past few months out, U.S. and Canada have a very brotherly relationship. So security for Canada really only meant protecting its homeland insofar as the U.S. military wasn't capable of doing it for them. However, nobody was going to get past the U.S., and so the requirement for Canada was really not that high at all. Certainly under a 100,000 troop requirement, and that's really what they've stuck to. However, times are changing. Now Trump is speaking publicly on multiple occasions about making Canada a state. Obviously, there are some pretty large barriers at stake for this exercise, so let's take this seriously, let's play through the mental exercise here. Firstly, there would be legal and constitutional barriers. Canada's constitution and political system do not provide an easy mechanism for dissolving the country. An annexation or merger with the U.S. would require a nationwide referendum and approval by each province, and most provinces, if not all of them, would be more likely to outright reject the idea. There's also public opinion and national identity, and we've already talked about some polls in this video. The majority of Canadians oppose annexation by the U.S. Canadian nationalism has actually increased as a result of the trade disputes with the United States. Quebec in particular would probably just oppose integration and would instead propose independence for themselves. They're kind of like Canada's version of Texas, only like French, so like not as cool, or maybe cooler. The Canadian government is very different from the U.S. political system. It has a stronger social welfare program, universal health care, and strict gun laws. Of course, those are not going to be implemented by the United States. So they would have to kind of get rid of those, and that would be a pretty significant event, not only economically, but politically and socially for Canada. Canadian politics also tend to be more centrist and left-leaning, meaning integration with a more polarized U.S. system would create a lot of political instability. And this would threaten the Republican Party unless, of course, political boundaries were to be redrawn in newly annexed Canadian provinces to better suit a more balanced political environment. Of course, in terms of, military integration, in terms of let's say Canada didn't want to get annexed, so they decided to resist. Let's just throw that out because their military is 25 times smaller. It doesn't, we'll just not act like that's going to happen. However, Canada's NATO membership and international alliances would definitely make an annexation of Canada politically disastrous for the United States. For example, with NORAD, Canada's been a very strong partner within NORAD. There's no need for the United States to take over Canada. We have the access into Canada that we already need right now. An annexation is completely unnecessary. NATO partners would look at the annexation of a NATO ally, taking over another NATO ally, a founding member nonetheless. That would be, a disaster. That would completely wreck trust of the United States outright. And we're already in a time where a lot of European partners are a little leery of trusting the United States politically and diplomatically. Yes, the U.S. would gain increased control of the Arctic. However, it would in turn be crashing its credibility and position in its key alliance networks. It would definitely not make America safer in the end. In terms of trade integration, that integration already exists. 75% of Canadian exports are already going to the United States. Economically, there's really not a lot of benefit of including Canada in the United States. It would remove some barriers, but it would also decrease trust in the U.S. economy, and the diplomatic impact would make its impact known in the U.S. markets. The U.S. would, however, gain control of Canada's oil reserves, its freshwater supply, and its mineral wealth. And there is, some benefit to that. Canadians themselves might benefit from access to a larger and more robust economy, but they would also get to enjoy, like all Americans, higher healthcare costs and weaker labor protections. Canada also has a very strong banking system, and it's ranked among the most stable in the world. However, U.S. deregulation of banking might actually introduce instability into that financial system, and that could pose some significant problems. In terms of cultural impact, Canada is very much its own thing. It's not really America light. Well, we Americans like to joke that it's America light because it's really the closest thing in terms of culture to the United States from just about anywhere, but it's not that. It's still Canada. French-speaking Quebec would, again, still probably prefer independence over connecting with the United States. Indigenous groups could face, diminished rights under the United States. Canadian law has really protected them in ways that the U.S. has failed to protect indigenous groups here. Again, Canada has stricter gun control laws, universal health care, and stronger social safety nets. The U.S. policies don't have that, and so that would be a pretty significant shock socially and politically and economically to Canada. So should any of this stuff happen? Well, I'll leave it to you in the comments to share what you think. If I were to give my own assessment, I think that the idea is outright very silly, and I don't think that it would really be very good for anybody, especially not the United States. But also, I don't think that any of us should be looking at Trump's comments particularly serious. What he says and what he does are by and large two very different things. But what do I know? I'm just some guy that makes YouTube videos. So let me know what you think down in the comments. This has been a very long video, so if you made it this far, I mean, honestly, hat tip and, shout out to you. Like if you enjoyed this video. Now, I'm hoping if you made it this long that you did enjoy the video. Share it with a friend if you want to get their thoughts involved in the comments. Let's just increase the amount of folks that are participating in this discussion. And subscribe for more analysis just like this. I've already posted some to the channel, and there will be more coming soon. So with all of that, I will see you all next time. Later.